So anyways, Pinocchio is transformed into a victim, and he's offered this identity, and he takes it. Now it's partly because he's deceived and manipulated, but it's also partly because the fox offers him the abandonment of responsibility as payment for adopting the victim identity. So this is where his own lack of morality, let's say, because this is all about Pinocchio's development as a character, plays a role in his demise. So if I'm a victim, then everyone else owes me something, and I don't have to take any responsibility. And so one of the things I've wondered, here's something to think about. It might be that the sense of meaning that life can provide to you is proportionate to the amount of responsibility you decide to take on. And that'd be very strange if it was the case, you know, because responsibility, of course, is a kind of weight, obviously, and it's difficult to take on responsibility. But if any positive emotion that you feel, and your control of anxiety, and the control over pain, is dependent on the activation of these systems that watch you move towards a desired goal, then the more complete and weighty the goal is, the more kick there's going to be in the observation that you're moving towards it. And you know, you kind of already know this, because you'll have observed in your own life that when you're engaged in something that you believe in, that the time passes properly. You know, you can see this even if maybe you're reading a paper and it's actually related in some intelligible manner to something that you want to learn. So even though it's difficult, you get engaged in it, you can remember it better, you can process it better, and you're not so likely to fall asleep, and you're not so likely to want to find distractions, all of that. You can get into it. And it would be very interesting if that was proportionate to the degree of responsibility that you're willing to shoulder, and I think you can make a strong case for that. I've also often wondered, imagine you could offer people a choice. Here's the choice. You could say, well, your life isn't meaningful. The nihilists have got it right. There's no meaning in your life. And because of that, there's no reason for you to accept any responsibility. So you can live a responsibility-free life, and maybe one of impulsive pleasure seeking, but a responsibility-free life, but the price you pay is that it doesn't get to be meaningful. Or you could say to someone, no, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to say, you can live a meaningful life, but it's only going to be as meaningful as the amount of responsibility that you're willing to bear. And then you might say, well, what would people choose? Because everybody also always makes noises about wanting to have a meaningful life. But if the price you pay for that is the adoption of responsibility, then it's not so obvious that people would choose meaning over, you know, over pointless pursuits, if the benefit they got for choosing the pointless pursuits was that they really didn't have to care about anything they ever did, right? There's no responsibility. And that's really what Pinocchio is offered. And that's what the coachman offers him. And that's interesting because, you know, so far it's been the fox and the cat, and they're kind of two-bit hoods. And so the pathological pathway that they offer Pinocchio is not the worst of the pathological pathways. But here, at least as far as the imagination, the collective imagination that created this movie is concerned, this is where you get to the most pathological form of, let's call it temptation. And that's the temptation to engage in, to abandon responsibility and to engage in impulsive pleasure seeking, short-term pleasure seeking. So here's the fox pretending to be a doctor, investigating Pinocchio's illness, and he makes some notes, which is all just meaningless scribble, right? It's like white noise. And it doesn't matter that the arguments that he's making are completely incoherent, and it doesn't matter that he actually doesn't know anything. What he's selling is easy to buy, and so Pinocchio buys it. And by the end of the conversation with the fox, he's pretty convinced that he's useless and that he needs a vacation. You know, this is an Oedipal situation as well, which I touched on in the other lecture. I mean, let's imagine that you have a child that is a little on the neurotic side, so high negative emotion, and maybe one that's also a little bit on the sickly side, so has a variety of, let's say, relatively minor ailments, but ailments nonetheless. And so what that means as a parent we'll say mother for this example because I want to use the Oedipal example, you have to make a decision all the time about exactly how you're going to treat that child. One decision is, well, I'm not going to, you don't have to go to school today because you're not feeling well. It's like, fair enough. But do you make the same decision the next day? And do you make the same decision the next day? And let's imagine that you enable the child to avoid responsibility as a consequence of capitalizing on their illness. Well, then that's not going to be very good for the child. The rule with a sickly child has to be something like, I'm going to push you right to your limit. Because otherwise, how is the person going to figure out what they can do? And if they can't figure out what they can do, then they're not going to be able to make their way in the world at all. And then that gets muddied very badly if you're not exactly sure that you want them to make their way in the world. You know, maybe you're just as happy because you'd be sitting at home alone if your child was there with you. And maybe you'd be just as happy at some level if they never grew up at all, because then they won't leave. And so, and maybe that's because you have a terrible marriage and you're lonesome, you know. Maybe it's an abusive marriage and your husband has chased away all your friends. And so you don't have anything at all. And maybe that's because you didn't stand up for yourself very well, apart from the fact that he was, you know, tyrannical in his central nature. And so then all those little warps and bends in your psyche are going to manifest themselves right in the background of every single one of those decisions. My daughter had a lot of illnesses when she was adolescent, and they were very serious, and it was very difficult to figure out what to do about that, because you couldn't exactly apply normative rules, right? And we always had to figure out, if she was communicating her symptoms to us, how seriously to take those. And the answer was the least amount of serious possible. It's something like that, because we needed to know, and she needed to know, what she could do in spite of the fact that she had problems. And one of the things I really tried to instill in her, and I think it worked, is that you don't ever want to use your illness as an excuse for not doing anything. Not consciously. You know, sometimes you might not know, I'm not feeling well, what can I do? Well, you don't know, right? Because sometimes when you're not feeling well, you can do more than you think, and sometimes you can do less than you think. It's not like it's obvious, but sometimes it's obvious, you know, this little temptation flits through your mind and you think, well, I don't really want to do what I'm doing today, and I'm not feeling very well, so I don't have to do it. You do that 100 times, then you don't know how sick you are anymore. And then you're in real trouble, because not only are you sick, but you actually you've muddied the waters. And so you have both problems then, is you're actually ill and you've betrayed yourself by using that as an excuse not to pursue your responsibilities. And that, I think, if you do both of those things happen to you at the same time, you're in real trouble. And it's really hard not to have that happen. So anyways, Pinocchio gets enticed into believing that he's a victim. The fact that he's insufficient is used as an excuse by the fox and the cat to offer him a trip to Pleasure Island. And this is, I think, where the movie gets particularly dark. And so off they go, singing away. They have to carry him. So you could say, in some sense, he's carried by societal pathology and his own trouble. He's carried like a puppet off to Pleasure Island. The dragon myth is that there's a dragon that lives under the ground that's eternal, and now and then it rises out of the ground to threaten the state. And someone within the state determines to go confront the dragon voluntarily, and does so, and then brings back something of great value. Sometimes, if the hero is generally male, sometimes the thing of great value is a female that the dragon has kidnapped. That's a St. George story. And sometimes it's gold and other treasure, like in the story of The Hobbit, and story that you all know very well. It's a classic hero story, and the hero story is another fundamental element of the clinical theories, I would say. It's predicated on the idea that you learn through voluntary contact with that frightens or disgusts you. And that's a hallmark of psychoanalytic theory. Carl Jung, who we'll discuss in detail, said his primary dictum was insterquilinus invenitur, which I'm sure I'm massacring because it's Latin, but it meant in filth it will be found. And one of the hallmarks of the clinical theories is that within the confines of everyone's experience, and you can think about this as experience out in the world or experience in the unconscious mind, there are dirty little secrets, let's say, and skeletons and dreadful old fears and remnants of abuse and memories of pathological behavior and failures of courage that leave you undeveloped, perhaps out of avoidance, and that the psychoanalytic process is precisely the careful encounter with those forgotten and repressed elements of the self, in the hope that a clear encounter will redeem them, unite them with the remainder of your personality, and make you stronger in consequence. And I would say that that's just a variant of the manner in which human beings learn, and we'll talk about this more in relationship to Piaget, because you always learn when you're wrong, which is very annoying. Now, what do you learn when you're correct? You're walking in the world, you're operating in the world, you have a sense of what you want to have happen. You're always looking at the world through this sense of what you want to have happen. You're acting so that what you want to have happen will happen. And when it happens, well, then you're happy because, well, first of all, you get what you want, and that's good, maybe, depending on what you want. But it's also good because if you get what you want when you act, then it turns out that your model of how to act is valid, right? The outcome, that you get what you want, indicates no error on the part of your model. But it's very frequently the case that when you act to get what you want, you don't get what you want. And then that's unpleasant because you don't get what you want, but it's even more unpleasant because it brings with it the hint of a suggestion that the manner in which you're construing the world is incorrect at some indeterminate level. So for example, if you tell a joke at a party, you presume that people will attend, and then when they hear the joke, they will laugh, and then if you tell the joke and it goes flat, or even worse, disgusts and offends people, then you're going to be taken aback, and that's partly because you didn't get what you want, and that's not so good, but it's more because there's something wrong with the way you conceptualize the situation. And then you're faced with a problem, and the problem is the emergence of a domain of the unknown. It's like, well, what kind of mistake did you make? Maybe you're not as funny as you think you are. That could be a big problem. Maybe you're not around people who are the way you think they are. Maybe they don't like you as much as you thought they liked you. I mean, the potential for various paranoid thoughts of increasing severity to come welling up at you in a situation where you make even a trivial social mistake is quite broad. And when you make an error of that sort, you have to face it and sort through all the possibilities so that you can find out what it was that you did wrong and how to retool it so that in the future you don't make the same mistake. And that requires, well, in some sense what you might describe as a journey into the belly of the beast being that place where things have fallen apart and where you're overwhelmed with negative emotion and chaos and confusion. And that's a very old story. That's the story of the journey to the underworld, and the hero is the person who makes the voluntary journey to the underworld to collect what's been languishing down there, and that's the basic motif of psychoanalytic theory. I would say it's the basic motif in some sense of clinical practice, because one of the things that you do as a clinician is find out what people are afraid of and what they're avoiding, and that can be in their past or in their present or in their future. Break it down into smaller pieces and help them devise strategies of approach and mastery, and that improves the quality of their personality and helps develop them into people who won't make the same mistakes over and over again. So people often ask me, do you believe in God? which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And they think they know. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero. So it's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis. But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. So that's a good enough answer for that. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that, for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. It's associated with death and rebirth, clearly, because the Logos dismantles you and rebuilds you. So that's what happens when you make an error. When you make an error, some part of you has to go. That's a sacrifice. You have to let it go. Sometimes it's a big part of you. Sometimes it can be such a big part of you that you actually die, right, instead of dying and being reborn. Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations. What's the ultimate extent of that? That's a good question. You know, the question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the Logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what the ultimate level of this. Now, the hypothesis is, and it's a hypothesis that extends to some degree to Buddha as well, the hypothesis is that there has been one or two individuals who managed that, and that in their management of that, they transcended death itself. Well, then you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean by transcended death? Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure for the time being, which I think is the simplest thing to assume. I think there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. You could conclude otherwise, but I feel that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. Is his resurrection real? Well, his spirit lives on. That's certainly the case.
In what sense do you mean spirit? Just to qualify that.
Well, let's imagine that a spirit is a pattern of being. And we know that patterns can exist, patterns can be transmitted across multiple substrates, right? Vinyl, electronic impulses, air, vibrations in your ear, neurological patterns, dance. It's all the translation of what you might describe as a spirit, right? It's that pattern. It's independent of its material substrate. Well, Christ's spirit lives on. It's had a massive effect across time. Well, is that an answer to the question? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible. The chaos is hiding in what's irrelevant. And that's a very interesting observation, because since the chaos is virtually infinite, it's a real question. Where the hell do you put it? Well, you put it in what you ignore. And you can ignore it as long as it isn't actively interfering with your movement forward. You can assume that it doesn't matter, that it isn't matter, that it doesn't matter. Same thing. All right, so here's the kicker. There's one more class of things that you can run into along the way. And this is where the chaos breaks through. So let's say you're moving from point A to point B, and something that you don't expect occurs. And it gets in the way. So let's say that you're living with someone, and maybe you kind of like them. You're not married, so you don't like them that much, because otherwise you'd ask them to marry you. But anyways, and so a quarter of you is looking for something better, and 3/4 of you is half satisfied, something like that. And then the person, because we're ambivalent about such things, and then the person you discover, or the person announces that they've been having an affair. Okay, so then how are you supposed to respond emotionally to that? Well, the part of you that wasn't all that committed to the relationship is kind of exhilarated by that, and then the 3/4 of you that's half satisfied is hurt, and you're going to exploit that part for sure in the ensuing discussions, and not mention the, oh, that's kind of exciting that you've, betrayed me that way. But the point is that that's a hole. Now what's happened is a hole you have this structure that you're walking on, like ice, like the thin ice that you're skating on, and now there's a hole in it. And the hole, we don't even know how deep the hole is, but you know there's a hole there, and so now you're anxious about it, although maybe also a little bit excited, because God only knows what's down there. But you don't know what to do with that hole, because it could spread very badly on you. It could be that the whole relationship was a facade, and that all your relationships have been facades, and that the reason that is because you're so damn shallow that it's impossible for you to have a relationship that isn't just a facade, and that's partly because you don't pay any attention to other people, and it's also partly because you're malevolent and selfish. So that's a nasty thing to discover. Or maybe that's the sort of person that you're attracting, which would make sense, actually, if that's the sort of person that you are. And so there are certain things that you can encounter that basically unglue you. And what happens is that those moments of being unglued travel up that entire hierarchy of presuppositions. It's like, because one of the logical conclusions to being betrayed in a relationship is that you're truly a bad person. Now, another equally logical conclusion is that the person that you're with is really a bad person, and another logical conclusion is all people are truly bad people. In macro ways and in micro ways, you can't trust anyone. You can't trust women, you can't trust men, you can't trust human beings, you can't trust yourself. The whole place is a catastrophe, it's a nightmare. Well, then you can fall through into chaos. Now, the way your body responds to that, or maybe, you're supposed to be getting a promotion at work. That's good. You're all chipper about the promotion at work, and you walk into your boss's office because he or she wants to see you, and they say, well, we've reviewed your performance over the last few years, and your performance has been somewhere between mediocre and decent, and we're downsizing, and see you later. That's not a raise or a promotion, that's for sure. That's a hole that you fall into. And the question is, well, what do you make of that, right? How do you frame that? How do you take that emergent chaos and make habitable order out of it? You don't know. Is the whole capitalist system rotten to the core? I mean, that's a convenient explanation under those circumstances, that's for sure. Were you working for a psychopathic son of a bitch? Did you make the wrong choice in university, and was that your father's fault because you never did what you want, or was it your fault for not standing up to him? Or is it a dying industry, or is maybe this a wake-up call that you should go do something else that you've been waiting to do, that you've actually wanted to do your whole life, and that's why you're doing such a miserable job at your current occupation, because you're bitter and resentful about the fact that you never did what you want? You don't know. It's all of those things at once. And that's very stressful, because all of those things at once is too many things. And that's the reemergence of chaos. That's the flood. That's the return to the beginning of the cosmos. That's another way that it's been represented mythologically. It's that you voyage all the way back to the beginning of the cosmos when there's nothing but undifferentiated chaos. And that's what you're confronting. And maybe it's too much for you. And often it is. I mean, that can be traumatizing. It can hurt your brain. It's just too much for you to bear. But it doesn't matter, you're stuck with it. And so how do you respond to that? Well, some of it is catastrophic negative emotion. You freeze, and that's protective. And maybe you don't even want to move. You don't want to bloody well get out of bed for a week, and that's because your body is reacting as if the bedroom floor is covered with snakes, and the best thing for you to do is just not move, just freeze. Not a pleasant situation to be in, because you're hyper aroused, very, very physiologically demanding, and there's zero about it that's productive, except maybe the snakes won't see you. But they've already seen you, so that isn't helping very well. So you've got all this undifferentiated negative emotion, anxiety, fear, hurt, anger, guilt, shame, emotional pain, the whole plethora of catastrophes. And then maybe on the other side, lurking down there is, thank God I'm done with that job. I just bloody well hate it. I drag myself off to work every day. And there's a little part of my soul that's so goddamn happy I finally got fired that I can hardly stand it. And maybe you don't even admit that to yourself because, well, that would mean that all that time you spent at the job was just sunk cost. You're deluding yourself the whole time. It is an interesting thing to consider, though, sometimes if you're in the unpleasant circumstance of having to fire someone. Sometimes firing someone is the best thing that can happen to them, which doesn't mean that you should go out and enjoy it. Although I have met very disagreeable people who actually enjoyed firing people. I'll tell you a story about that at some point because it's quite interesting. But, sometimes if someone's just limping along in their job and doing it as miserably and wretchedly as they possibly can imagine, the best thing you can do for them is to say, you're failing at this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you would have to be failing at absolutely everything else in the entire world. So maybe you should just accept the damn failure and go off and try something new. And I mean, that's terrifying for people, and I know they hate it and all that, but sometimes it's better than the alternative, which is just slow, torturous death.